In 1886, the French scientist Gaston Maspero was engaged in his usual work at the museum. He extracted mummies from sarcophagi, examined them, and made necessary notes. However, the contents of one of the sarcophagi startled even the experienced scholar. So, at first glance, it was an entirely unremarkable sarcophagus. However, that's precisely what caught Gaston's attention. Typically, on the burial chest of Egyptian pharaohs and other notable individuals, there were various symbols that indicated whose remains they belonged to. But on the sarcophagus that Gaston noticed, there were no markings whatsoever. What was even stranger, the body was wrapped in a sheepskin, which the ancient Egyptians considered impure. Gaston Maspero unwrapped the mummy, and the first thing he discovered was that its legs and arms were bound for some unknown reason. When Gaston shifted his gaze to the mummy's head, he found its face frozen in a screaming expression, with the mouth appropriately opened. Due to the peculiar attire, bound hands, and tormented facial expression, experts hypothesized that the person had been poisoned or possibly subjected to torture before death. However, the truth only became clear after some time. During further investigations, scientists found similar remains. It turned out that the screaming facial expression had no connection to the mummified person's agonizing death. The reason was that if the jaw wasn't deliberately secured during the mummification process, it naturally opened as the body decomposed, creating that very scream-like appearance. Thus, the alarming mummies with frightening facial expressions received a perfectly logical explanation unrelated to mysticism. Headless gladiators. During archaeological excavations in the province of York, England, several skeletons were discovered. All of them belonged to 45-year-old men, and this finding wouldn't have been so astonishing if it weren't for one significant detail. All the skeletons were headless. Either there were no skulls at all, or they were located around the chest or even the legs of the skeletons. Further research revealed that all the burials could be attributed to the 2nd to 40th century AD. At that time, this region was part of the Northern Roman Empire. Since the majority of the skeletons were particularly tall and showed signs of injuries, scientists logically speculated that the bones could belong to gladiators. Genetic analysis of the 7 decapitated skeletons showed that most of them were of British origin, while one possibly hailed from the Middle East. The high number of injuries and the absence of skulls could indicate that the remains belonged to military personnel. Nevertheless, there is still no definitive answer to why the skeletons were decapitated. Traces of witch hunting. Frightening archaeological discoveries can be associated not only with bones and skulls. In a 15th century church in Aberdeen, Scotland, an interesting artifact is preserved. Inside the chapel stands a stone column with an iron ring protruding from it. This ring was possibly used to restrain the accused during the late 16th century. During that time, Aberdeen, and Scotland as a whole, witnessed a series of witch trials known as the Great Witch Hunt. Around 400 people were brought to trial, and approximately 200 individuals were executed within the span of a year. The deaths were horrifying, with many of the condemned being burned at the stake. It is evident that many of those accused were not witches and had no intention of being so. Historians continue to debate the true reasons behind the witch-hunting frenzy during that period. In the mid-19th century, the English physician and explorer John Ray explored the Canadian coast of the Arctic Ocean. During his journey, he interacted with the Inuit people who shared horrifying stories about a lost expedition whose members perished in those regions. According to the Inuit accounts, they went mad and even resorted to cannibalism. The remains of the expedition members were discovered over 100 years later in the 1980s, finally confirming their identities. In the 19th century, Many sailors were perplexed by the search for the legendary Northwest Passage, a route from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Arctic. The quest for the Northwest Passage claimed numerous lives, including the 129 explorers who embarked on the Arctic exploration in 1845. The expedition was led by Admiral John Franklin but ultimately ended in failure. All crew members died from starvation, scurvy, and hypothermia. Traces of lead poisoning were found on many of the remains, likely due to the consumption of poorly preserved canned food. High levels of lead in the body can cause vomiting, weakness, and convulsions, making the deaths of many crew members truly agonizing. Not all the travelers were properly buried, and the condition of some remains indeed indicated instances of cannibalism among the crew members. Mass burial of headless Vikings. Archaeologists were conducting excavations on the side of an old road in the Dorset region of Great Britain. Suddenly, instead of the usual stones or tools, they unearthed something truly chilling. It was a mass grave containing the remains of 54 Vikings, all of whom were decapitated. Scientists began analyzing the carefully arranged positions of the bones and noticed some peculiarities. Specifically, the bones of the legs and arms, heads, and torsos were neatly grouped separately. So what happened? One theory proposed by archaeologists was that after the capture of the Vikings by the villagers, they were executed and then buried in this manner. However, this hypothesis did not explain why the unfortunate Vikings were decapitated with precise sword strikes delivered from the front. If it were an execution, the sword blows would have been inflicted from behind. In reality, the archaeologists later reconsidered their theory and suggested that this could have occurred due to the Vikings falling victim to some unusual sacrificial ritual. However, there is simply no mention of such rituals being widespread in the region at that time. Thus, the true cause of this mass burial remains to be discovered. In the 1980s, an expedition explored mountain caves in New Zealand and discovered something resembling a dinosaur's leg. It turned out that the leg with its bones belonged to an extinct flightless bird called the moa. Approximately 700 to 800 years ago, moa became extinct in New Zealand, specifically due to human hunting. However, prior to that, they had inhabited the Earth for millions of years. According to scientists' estimations, ancient moa appeared over 15 million years ago. This particular finding, which was discovered in a cave, is over 3,000 years old and is remarkably well preserved. By the way, moa is the only species of birds that completely lacked wings. We have already mentioned the frightening discoveries related to witch hunts, but approximately a century after the witch hunts, the period of vampire hunting began. The real history of Eastern European vampires is quite possibly more terrifying than fictional stories about Dracula. In the 17th century, in the territory of Poland, some people were buried with sickles around their necks or stones wedged in their mouths. These precautionary measures were taken to prevent the dead from rising again and encountering vampires, who, according to the beliefs of the local residents, would return to continue sucking blood. Later, it was discovered that some of these burials attributed to vampire burials had no connection to vampires at all. No injuries were found on the remains, and scientists concluded that the cause of death for these individuals was actually a cholera epidemic. The term chemical warfare is typically associated with military conflicts of the past century. However, archaeologists have discovered the remains of soldiers who fell victim to this type of weaponry 2,000 years ago. During the siege of a city in the territory of Syria, which was under the control of the Roman Empire at the time, Persian soldiers dug tunnels beneath the city walls with the intention of using them to undermine the fortifications. The Romans launched a counterattack, breaching their own tunnels in an attempt to intercept the Persians. But the Persians heard their approach. Some archaeologists believe that the Persians had prepared a terrifying trap, a cloud of poisonous chemical smoke that literally dissolved the victims' lungs. The positioning of the soldiers' remains supports this hypothesis. While we had suspected that ancient battles were marked by particular cruelty, few would have imagined that it was this severe. In 2010, researchers reported the discovery of Neanderthal family skeletons in a cave in Spain. However, what makes this finding particularly disturbing is the presence of cannibalism evidence on the remains. It is likely that the Neanderthals, whose remains were found by the researchers, fell victim to another group of Neanderthals. Archaeologists lean towards the belief that cases of cannibalism occurred among Neanderthals during difficult periods. However, all of this took place before humans inhabited the area. Although Neanderthals belong to the human species, they are not our direct ancestors. Interestingly, despite having larger skulls and brain size compared to modern humans, their cognitive abilities were significantly lower. Evidence of human sacrifices is encountered by archaeologists worldwide. However, one example that was found in 2008 seems particularly peculiar. In an ancient building on the territory of present-day Syria, archaeologists discovered strangely arranged human and animal bones. 3 human skeletons were lying side by side, and based on the unusual skeletal damage and other details, researchers identified one of the skeletons as a possible ancient acrobat. Carefully studying the data of this finding, scientists made the assumption that the remains belonged to a group of ancient performers who were sacrificed to appease a natural disaster. Perhaps it was the fact that the victims were well-known individuals of their time that led to their selection. The contemporaries believed that offering them as sacrifices would be maximally effective. One of the mysterious findings of archaeologists is the so-called figurines of the ancient Kimbaya civilization. These artifacts were discovered in the territory of modern-day Colombia. The most attention-worthy are the jewelry figurines shaped like airplanes. When you learn that they were created 2,000 years ago, this fact becomes truly astonishing. In other words, they were so ahead of their time that some believe they were inspired by extraterrestrials or even time travelers. The reason these theories cannot be dismissed lies in the fact that if these figurines were recreated to the size of actual aircraft, they could theoretically fly. However, most scientists are rather skeptical of this idea. They lean towards the version that the winged Kimbaya figurines were stylized depictions of birds, lizards, amphibians, flying fish, and insects that were typical of that region. Don't forget to like if you found this video interesting. Also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon.